after knocking over the Australian Test cricket team. When the West Indies came to Australia with 7 uncapped players, questions were asked about how seriously they were taking this Test series. Turns out, pretty seriously. The Windies drew the 2 Test series off the back of
from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
Podcasts, radio, news, music, and more.
Shamar Joseph around the wicket trying to get this last wicket. He bowls now and he bowls. He's won! They've won! Shamar Joseph has knocked the stump out of the ground. He's rushing around the field. This is a huge victory lap. Oh, one of the great moments in the history of West Indies cricket.
I don't know about you, but I'm still smiling at the image of young Shamar Joseph screaming across the turf of the Gabba with his 10 teammates in tow after knocking over the Australian Test cricket team. When the West Indies came to Australia with 7 uncapped players, questions were asked about how seriously they were taking this Test series. Turns out, pretty seriously. The Windies drew the 2 Test series off the back of youth, enthusiasm, and a whole lot of fun. How good can this group be, and what does it mean for Test cricket in the Caribbean? Who better to ask than Carl Hooper? I'm Poppy Penny, and this is ABC Sport Daily. Carl Hooper is a former West Indian captain, current assistant coach for the white ball team, and possibly one of the happiest men alive at the moment. Carl, firstly, you were at the Gabba yesterday. Has what happened sunk in yet?
Well, slowly. I think you probably, have a chance to really sit down and think about it, especially after I can't say a good night's rest because we had so much to drink last night. Had a bit of a hangover this morning, but no, look, it was amazing. To see 11 fairly inexperienced cricketers, well, certainly at least half the squad go up against the mighty Australians and win a Test match here, something we haven't done for some 27 years.
A huge performance by the West Indies. Well played, the Windies.
No, it was fantastic. I was glad I was there to witness it.
As you touch on, it's been 27 years since the West Indies have beaten Australia in Australia. What does it mean not just to this group, but also West Indian cricket as a whole? We saw a lot of emotion from yourself and from the likes of Brian Lara. What does it mean for West Indian cricket?
Without a doubt, I'm sure you would have heard that the West Indies CEO, Mr. Johnny Graves, has come out publicly and said very clearly about the split as far as countries dividing money so that some of the, not necessarily less fortunate, but the less funded countries can get a bigger slice of the pie so that we can make sure that we've got structures and facilities and so on in place in order to nurture young talent. I hope this is a push because it just goes to show that with adequate funding, I reckon West Indies cricket could probably return to its heyday. But unless you've been to the Caribbean and looked at our facilities, looked at the amount of cricket, young, boys and girls, that's available for them to play, then you wouldn't appreciate exactly what happened at the Gabba yesterday. So hopefully, winning the Test match goes a long way towards making the ICC stand up and have a look, not only for West Indies, but, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka. We've all got financial issues. So if they can maybe revisit the way that they split the money gained from world cricket, it probably could help us.
The West Indies came to Australia with, as you touch on, an inexperienced lineup. People weren't really sure what to expect in terms of results, but they have massively exceeded any expectations. What was the mindset of this group coming into this Brisbane Test in particular?
Well, after being beaten, in 2.25 days, you would have thought they'd be sort of saying to themselves, maybe let's just get this one out of the way, get on a flight and go back home. I mean, we were completely outplayed in Adelaide.
And Australia, prior to lunch on the third day, have won this game by 10 wickets.
But just watching them compete for the last 4 days here in the Gabba, the good thing about it, I don't think they had any scars. And they were up for the challenge. So I reckon it was a positive one. I think they're actually looking forward to it. Looking forward to the challenge of going up against this Australian side for the second Test and seeing if we can't compete better, because even in the dressing room last night, having a couple of drinks, and they seem happy-go-lucky, as if they didn't understand exactly what just transpired. I think down the line, a few years from now, as they get older, they will understand what they actually achieved, because they don't know how well. I suppose they have an inkling as to how good this Australian side is, but it was almost a scenario of David slaying Goliath last night.
I want to talk to you about your countryman, Shamar Joseph. He was possibly the most exciting thing to come out of that test match. 24-year-old quick bowler who took 7 for with a broken toe. Talk to me about who is this kid and where he's come from.
Well, I'm just like you. Well, I probably know a little bit more about Shamar Joseph than you. You probably heard about him during the Adelaide Test match. Shamar is from a place called Baracara. As a son of the soil, born and bred in Guyana, I've never heard of the place. So you definitely know it's down in the sticks. But look, he's come on the scene with a bang.
Here he comes, Shamar Joseph, his first ball in Test cricket to Steve Smith. It's a nick! He's got a wicket! And the West Indies strike Shamar Joseph. He's almost run to the point boundary. What a moment!
I first saw Shamar last year in the Caribbean when we came and bowled in the nets to the West Indies squad. We had a T20 game against India, and he came and he bowled. But I didn't really see anything, to make me look up and say, wow, we got to fast track this kid. But he obviously had something there, because the selectors picked him then to go to South Africa on the West Indies A side and then fast-tracked him straight into the Test squad.
Shamar Joseph around the wicket, bowls Alex Carey. Australia is 6 down, and Shamar Joseph in his second Test is turning the tide.
Welcome to tonight's edition of Politics 101 on a Tuesday night. Thank you all for all the comments and commentaries from last night's program. The linking of cricket to politics and our ongoing struggle. And I played that excerpt there from Carl Hooper because I think he put it in context, especially when he said that the young players perhaps didn't quite understand what they just did. And that is okay. That is okay. That is okay. But to hear Carl Hooper and others and to watch Brian Lara and Hooper cry, it puts it all in perspective. There's a consciousness that sometimes those cricketers don't express because, politics is seen in partisan terms. But they understand the importance of cricket to our larger Caribbean society. And tonight we're going to have Professor Thomas on. And people like Thomas and Beckford and Rodney and all those fellas, those scholar activists from the 1960s coming through. What Joseph did on the cricket field is what they spent all their years working for. A Caribbean society that can stand in the world with its head up. To hear them in Australia, to hear all those white people, Australians, recognizing that we have something to say to the world. We have a story to tell, and that we are equal when the rules are the same for everybody. We are equal. We are equal. Good evening and welcome to the Open Word edition of Politics 101. Professor Clive Thomas and Dr. Dennis Canterburyd are going to be here tonight. And we're going to be talking about the Buxton proposal. Last night, you all know that I was doing it. And I made the point that if each household in Baracara, if each household was given that $1 million that Professor talked about, think about how many more Shamar Josephs we will produce. And that is why I was angry that Irfan Ali and the rest of them would be celebrating Shamar Joseph. They ought not to, because they are denying Shamar Joseph and people like him an opportunity. Because had they embraced the Buxton proposal and put it into effect, we could open up the pipeline for so many other young black and brown and poor boys and girls coming through the system, not only in cricket, but in other areas. And I was happy to hear Ian Bishop making the point that we now have to compensate. And this is what he said. We have to compensate Shamar Joseph. And we have to take care of him and other players like that to make sure they stay in the Caribbean, stay fresh. And he said it has to be an effort between Cricket West Indies, the Guyana government, the Guyana Cricket Board, and private companies. But he stressed the Guyana government. Bishop is not a fool, as you all know, those of you who follow cricket. He knows that Guyana now has money. And I don't know whether Ian Bishop heard about the Buxton proposal. But when we look at Shamar Joseph there, the Buxton proposal comes to mind. How do we use our oil resources to help our people to directly develop their own resources? That is what we mean by development. Development is about people. Good evening, whether you're joining us from Barracara, whether you're joining us from down the Kanji Creek, at other areas there. If you're Bobitian, you must feel proud. You must feel proud. There was another Bobitian there, Kevin Sinclair, throwing himself in the air and taking some catches, making 50 runs in his first outing. Good evening to all of you, whether you're inside of Guyana or outside of Guyana. It's a good time to be a Guyanese. And it is our job to make the linkage between what that young man did in Australia and our own struggle for human emancipation. That our politics is not just about party politics and, leaders and so on. It's also about ordinary people. And that's what Shamar Joseph has reminded us. That ultimately this is about ordinary people. That young man with a pink ball in his hand, is transformed. They said he was a security guard. Well, there's dignity in labor. There's dignity in labor. Nothing is wrong in being a security guard. But with a pink ball in his hands, what we call social mobility begins. And that is why CLR James talked about beyond the boundary. When he took his wickets, he ran for the boundary because it's happening there. There's a linkage between what's happening beyond the boundary and what he did on the field. It's so lovely. And thank all of you for your comments, and because we have been talking about Shamar Joseph on this program. And so we earned the right. We earned the right to celebrate. So tonight we're going to be talking about the Buxton proposal. Professor Thomas, in 2018, in Buxton, Emancipation Celebration unveiled that plan. As I always say, it's not a new plan because they've been doing it, using it in other parts of the world, in our region, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Asia. But it was new to Guyana. And it was instructive that the responses to that proposal fell in two categories. Those who poured cold water on it and those who embraced it. And it was fitting that the poor and the powerless embraced it. They didn't know all the economic theories and all that, but their instinct made them embrace it. And those who were steep in all the theorization and the theories, basically it came down to them feeling that if you give poor people money, they wouldn't know what to do with it. They would just chip in it. But I think from 2018 to now, they have been proven wrong, because the proposal keeps getting more and more popular among the masses. And some of the elites have come around to it. So what Professor Thomas has been doing, he's been updating the proposal. He's been updating the proposal. Because, of course, 6 years is a long time when you consider what has happened in those 6 years, that we have transformed from a normal, regular political economy to a petrol state. And you're hearing all these talks, the fastest growing economy in the world and all these things. And we should not poo-poo those things. What we need to do is to put them in perspective. So let's bring in Professor Thomas and my co-host, Dr. Dennis Canterburyd. Professor Thomas, Dennis Canterburyd, Dr. Canterburyd, good evening to you all.
Good evening, David.
Good evening, David.
See why I know that you keep up with your cricket, and you're a Caribbeanist, and I tried in my introduction there to make the connection between your own work and what Shamar Joseph did on that world stage. Would you mind reflecting for a minute on that issue?
I think, David, it's in the very essence of everything I do. I have a great fundamental belief in our capabilities. And I think that is largely because we survived the Middle Passage. That was one of humanity's greatest challenges that ever faced the humankind. And we survived it. So we can do anything. And we have done everything.
Emotions. The emotions there. Professor Clive Thomas, like so many of us, crying, shedding tears, because that is what that young man did, and so many of us cried. So many of us cried. Professor, you
Well, I was only crying for that, but I was very anxious to ensure that we don't treat the coming of oil to Guyana and the opportunities the wind of oil presents to engage in a trivial challenge as to whether it's real or not real. I know there's a temptation to go down that way to that type of politics. And I was hoping that we might be able to transition to a politics of plenty, a politics of trying to make the capabilities of the people.
Dennis, you want to come in?
Yeah, I see why I remember you used to bat at number 3 as a cricketer, right? I seen you coming in with your pads and very making the 50. I remember seeing you making 50.
Everybody thought it was a joke.
Just trying to change the mood a bit.
Dennis, were you following the West Indies in Australia there?
No, but I'm familiar with the outcome.
Right, all of us are. Yeah. The linkage between what we are talking about and what you have spent your life, CY has spent his life, so many of us have spent our lives doing. The linkage between that. Yeah.
Indeed. I see why I'm saying there, there isn't anything that we can't do once we've put our minds to it.
we're living testimony to that fact. I think all three of us here are examples of that. And there's so many more. There's so many more who are testament to the fact that we can do anything coming from where we came from, not with a silver spoon in our mouths.
Yeah.
So I was trying to kind of lighten up a little bit so that see if I could remember the days when he would be coming out as number 3.
Yeah, my mind went right back to that generation, CY's generation, and what they have spent their lives doing. And as I watch the young man, but not just the young man, but the reaction of the world to
and
what
the way he carries himself.
Yes.
He has an excellent voice.
Yeah. It appears, and I heard that young man. I played the clip last night, and they asked him about Barakara, and he said, "We are financially challenged, but we never were hungry." You know, and to hear this young man, Barakara doesn't have a secondary school.
I know.
They just have a primary school, and the young people have to leave and go to New Amsterdam to go to secondary school, and often they don't go back. And the fear that community could disappear, and he says that he wants to use his money to ensure that doesn't happen.
I saw that it's a maroon community.
Yes, it was remarkable to hear that young man really expressing the energy and the instincts, and he didn't go to a university and all of that. Yeah, and he was expressing the instincts. See why the Buxton proposal unveiled in Buxton in August of 2018.
Yeah.
It's now almost 6 years.
Yeah.
And you've been working on updating it. Tell us, what are the areas that you have been really focusing on as you seek to update the proposal?
Well, I think primarily I'm focusing on what is effectively a complete rewrite. The central ideas remain, the central aims remain, but I need to put it in context. And the two contexts which I think that are the most important at this point in time are, firstly, whether we can afford it still, and I think the evidence seems to be going that way. And secondly, how can we update it to make it a more practical or applicable target for removing poverty 6 years after. So those are the two priorities that I've set myself in the task.
You know, I noticed that you seem to focus on income poverty. What is that? What is income poverty? And is there other forms of poverty?
Oh, yes, there are many other forms of poverty.
That the proposal might be able to address?
Well, it'd be very difficult for me to be addressing all the various areas, but the shift that has occurred in the world and the shift that has occurred in the measurement and continuous reporting on poverty in Guyana is towards a multidimensional view of poverty. It is no longer confined to money income. Even though we set up a dollar value, that is supposed to be the cost of living basket that we need to give to households to ensure that they can participate fully in society in all its dimensions. That's what the universal basic income says about it and aims at. It's the income supplementation, but it's supposed to be supplementing all the other capabilities. It's really a way of advancing the capability of the household to participate in several different areas that they cannot participate in at the levels of privation that comes with poverty. Some of it might have to do with housing, some of it might have to do with schooling, some of it might have to do with health, some of it might have to do with environmental protection, some might have to do with sanitation, some might have to do with your cultural experiences and participation in religious and other activities,
Freedom.
social activities in the community, freedom, security, all those things are there. So it's not a money income in the limited sense that money is the only means towards these things, but certainly a principal requirement for these things. An unconditional condition that you must satisfy before you're able to participate without being deprived of those types of things. So from that point of view, it has a dollar value.
See why, if I may take you back to a big macro question. And last night on the program, I ventured, because the Spirit took me there, to make the point that if each household in Barracara was given $1 million per year as the original Buxton proposal had projected, what that would do for that community and for other similar communities around the country. I was making the linkage between what that young man did and what it means in the larger context of our political economy. And make that linkage for us, please.
Well, I mean, I'm presuming that is accurate, but I haven't checked. Literally, I haven't checked the map or the Stats Bureau. I heard there are about 350 households there. I might be wrong. But
350 people.
350 people?
Yes.
Households.
I think they said it's a population of 350 to 400.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so that let's say they have roughly 100 households.
Right.
But the average household size for Ghana as a whole is 4.2 persons. Yeah. So let's assume that 100 by $1 million, that gives the community, that little community, $100 million of additional income, which I think goes some way towards allowing them to do things like ensure their cricket fields are the lawns are proper, the pitches are proper, to ensure that nobody goes hungry. He says that already, but maybe improve the quality of shelter. Maybe attract somebody to come in at least once or twice a week with a private or social or semi-private and public type of medical service for the children and the persons living in the area. So that possibility is there. And they can also think of maybe trying to encourage somebody to eventually try to open a fourth education school beyond the primary.
Yes.
So all those possibilities exist, and that is why I think that people forget that people with low incomes try to spend it on things that they think are important for their communities and their own self-upliftment. I think they underestimate, therefore, that the amount of investment that is possible for them to want to have to do when given the opportunity within their community, because they have the means by which they can pursue that investment. So I would say that the multiplying effect in a community like that of an extra $100 million per year means a lot.
Means a lot. Dennis, any follow-up question along those lines?
Yes. I think that it's good to be able to look to see what this universal basic income can actually do in communities where people actually live. And it's also good to say for the readers of the column in the newspapers on the universal basic income, it's also important to get them to clarify some of the terms and the concepts so that they could also have clarity about what it is you mean by this. Because I've heard comments about some people not being able to understand the terms. And so, for example, when you say like you would sort of like a matrix, what's that? Where's a matrix?
You use the word, I didn't.
I don't know. I'm asking you. Listen, I'm a man in the street.
I use the
and
word
I'm reading
metrics.
the column and I see that.
I use the word metrics.
Metrics, right?
I'm talking about measurements. I just use the word for measure. Metrics are the
Okay.
figures.
Okay.
That's the common
So
meaning of
it's just the measurement. And
Yeah.
then a term like say
and I could get into that diagram with only 4 letters.
yeah, right. So what are these 4 drivers? What's that?
These are the 4 forces that propel whether or not we'll be able to get enough money. One of them has to be but do we have enough resources guaranteed of oil in the ground to justify it? So we have pursued, we've done that already. We pursued an evaluation of the data on the volume of oil that is estimated to be underground in Guyana. And this varies considerably from $11+ billion barrels of oil, rather, by the oil company that's leading it, ExxonMobil, to 54 billion. That is the figure suggested and held by some private speculators in the States, to 24 billion by the government of Guyana, and just above that, 28 to 30 billion by me. And the basis for these estimates, the modeling that led to these particular amounts, is expressed in the articles. The second driver to the oil opportunity talks about a period of time that is being modeled globally by which oil will stop being easily sold once produced because of the transition to the climate. And that's around the 2050s, when most people expect that by then renewable energy will replace oil because of the carbon emissions. And oil will therefore face a very challenging market. So we have about 50 years of clear, and probably easily competitive, because our oil is a premium oil, exports of oil for Guyana. The one that we're looking at now is the government take. That is the average effective tax rate that is being applied to the oil sector. And that's one where they have a lot of confusion existing in the literature, so I have to wade through all of that. And a lot of it is clearly deliberate misinformation and disinformation. So the treacherous ground to go through, because people are hostile to ExxonMobil for whatever reasons, including we know some definitively financed by other oil groups, NGOs, if you want to call them that, or social groupings that disguise themselves as private and non-commercial entities in the United States, whose information is regularly published in some of our local media. And now I notice that because of my continuous writing on these things, their websites are getting harder and harder to find what they originally said. So some of those articles I wrote are historically significant for being able to trace them, because Rockefeller has such a huge life and death struggle with Exxon that they fund most of the financial work and analysis exposing Exxon. So we don't want to enter into that controversy, because I don't have any interest in trying to protect any multinational corporation. But that plays a very important part too in the way in which people perceive the problem. And then the last driver is the cost ratios that have been established through modeling. This is done by not me, but by the Inter-American Development Bank, IADB. And they've published a report on Guyana's oil, and they've modeled the cost of production by major category like CAPEX, capital expenditure, OPEX, operational expenditure, decommissioning, things like that, trading costs and so on. 5 or 6 major categories of costs, and we have that. I've already written on it, so all I'm doing is recapitulating, recapping on what I wrote on that. Because I went through the report of the IDB. They thought that they were going to satisfy the controversy with their report, but people just ignore it. But I wrote about 6 months of continuous.
So if what you're saying is so well studied and
I don't say it's well studied,
based on what you just said there, right? If it's studied even to that extent, why is it some people are saying that how would you respond to those who would say that it's going to make people get lazy and they're not going to want to work? It's best to take the money and put it into building factories and manufacturing. And so because I've heard that too, coming from economists.
Yeah, but you see, the thing is that we have to be able to get into the choice of what we're going to do with the money very early. And that is why I think it's important to rely on the truth. And the truth is we have a lot of resources, so we have to start thinking of what the best way to use the resources. The government has started out, they produce their own, decided to set up the gas factory. There's very little debate prior to that. In fact, it's come so late that it's almost inevitable that it will go through. Why you know there's another skeleton factory? All these things got to be evaluated. There's no a priori case for anything like that.
In case you're just joining us, this is our Tuesday night edition of Politics 101. It's Open Word tonight, in which we look at all things starting from the standpoint of our economy. We're looking tonight at our Guyana, our Caribbean, through the lens of economics. In particular, we are focusing on the Buxton proposal, better known to most of you as the cash transfer proposal made by Professor Clive Thomas on behalf of the WPA. As I go around the country, people always remind me, Dr. Hines, we don't forget the $1 million. The $1 million proposal. That's how people refer to it in the villages and the words in the tongue. And we are trying to make the linkage between what's happening on the cricket field and this proposal to empower our people, our poor people, the poor, the powerless. And in the era when we are getting more money than we ever got before since independence, it is time that we bring that proposal, refresh it, and bring it back into our collective consciousness. And that's what we're talking about tonight. Professor Thomas, you have long projected, when they were talking about 11 billion barrels, you were talking about 25 billion barrels upwards. And now you've pushed it to 30 billion barrels.
The story is even worse. Early on, when the first find was made, we have on record people who were now writing, and that's why you ignore them, who have claimed that we would never find more than 600 million barrels of oil to 1.3 billion barrels of oil in Guyana. People have got that in print. Before the year was out, 2020, when the first year of production, we'd already raised the level of discovery of oil to 3 or 4 or 5 billion barrels by then. Now the companies themselves are saying 11 plus. But the oil companies now not giving any update on that. That has been over a year. And it's deliberate because they know that
Yes.
they want to attract competitive investors. I mean, that's part of their defense, I think. The government itself, in trying to encourage persons to come to participate in the competitive bids, auctions put out for oil, said that we had 24 billion. That's the first time the government of Guyana ever put their weight around the figure. Which is more than twice what Exxon is saying,
Yes.
And nobody noticed it, even though I write about it and point out.
Yeah.
It doesn't treat as casual, so there it is. I, at that time, had given an official estimate based on the work that I discovered done by the U.S. Geological Services of 13 to 15 billion barrels of oil. And I was laughed out of court, widely exaggerated, blah, blah, blah. I lived to see the government last year announce twice that among the same people that were laughing at the estimate.
Yes. I remember when the Buxton
Yeah,
proposal came out, and they were trying to say that we couldn't afford what you were proposing.
Yeah.
And I remember, but see why I'm asking you an obvious question, but for the purposes of our program, I would like to get you to expand on it. We know why the oil companies are not likely to say the truth about how much oil we have for obvious reasons. Why is it important for us to tell the truth about how much oil they actually
because we need to do it to be able to plan the future.
There you go.
The government has no interest in secrecy from its people. We need to know that to get into a real argument about what we can afford and we can't afford. We must have that argument. But if we allow the government to sit back and just let it flow without making any interventions other when they were forced to, because they were forced to do that privately to the investors. So they won't put in the auction blindly because it's required by law. International law, not local law. You can't have a public auction globally and not state what it is that you're auctioning off. As you might be sued for fraud. They know that and they don't want to be taken to courts, international courts, for misleading some investor who might come in and don't get a bid. So they have to come up with a figure. And they came up with 24 billion barrels.
There you go. Professor, let me go to the follow-up question before I bring in Dr. Canterburyd. So when you unveiled the Buxton proposal in 2018, it was based on an estimation of how many barrels?
Yeah, it was. And I estimated 13 to 15.
13 to 15. And now you're estimating...
At that point of time, the oil production had not started.
Right.
Our first oil was in 2019.
Yes.
December 2019.
Yes.
So when I published my estimate, and let's say $40 million, this was even before the first barrel of oil was produced. So that's why it needs updating. And that's one of the reasons why I'm updating it.
And you're estimating now 27 billion to 30 billion.
Yeah.
And of course, when we have to control for things like prices on the world market and so on and so forth. How does all of that figure into your calculation?
All that is part of the calculation.
All that is part of the calculation.
But the calculation would affect the resources we have as against what companies might call their reserves.
Right.
That is their confirmed reserves, so they can go to the market to raise money to produce the oil. Because they can't lie to the market, You can't go and say in the market you have 100 billion barrels of oil where you don't. That be collecting money by fraudulent means.
Yes.
So the companies are bound by commercial law, not what Guyana writes in his books. So they can't go to the market like so. They have an interest in not exaggerating what it is, because if they caught out, they have some severe penalties to pay, and their penalties are not whimsical like in Guyana. These are penalties that will cost them money, dollars out of their pockets, and that's what their shareholders that own in the company want to make sure that their money is spent wisely and they get the maximum returns from their private investment. That's the difference between these companies that are operating in Guyana based on the countries of their jurisdiction and the requirements of their laws and requirements of all local laws. And these companies are therefore governed by company law, not ministerial edict or ministerial direction of government. You can't go to the marketplace and lie. You can't go to the marketplace and say the government is going to tell me to do this, so that's why I did it. They are
So-
bound by laws. Their shareholders own the companies.
Yeah.
And the people who are running them are managers of the companies on behalf of their shareholders. So the tight legal requirement that drives them to search for profit in that way. It is
Dr.
not a
Canterburyd?
voluntary thing.
Yeah, following up on what you hit on the point you just mentioned, David, about which Clive talked about in the article about adjusting the payout, the UBI, based on. So the question is, why the adjustment, CY? You want to base the adjustment on US
Yeah, well,
price?
the thing is that if it was done in 2018, obviously 6 years after the cost of the basket of goods required to keep the household going might have changed. I don't know. I haven't calculated that yet. That's going to be the end of the series. It's going to change either because the exchange rate changes, or if that doesn't change, the price level changes. Price level both in Guyana and the United States. So some adjustment has to be made.
See why? We
And
know.
what made me remark on that particularly is that 2 weeks ago, an editorial in the Starbucks News, I saw it, referred to the fact that what they were all fighting against as a radical proposal has turned out to be fairly conservative to them relative to what we're earning now.
Right.
Because after the $1 trillion budget, they suddenly realize that the figures I'm talking about are easily compatible with that.
There you go. There you go. And I go back to when the proposal was unveiled, and to those who said that we cannot afford it. I remember that well. Those who said that we're never going to afford it. We're never going to be able to afford giving each household $1 million Guyana dollars per year. I remember that, and we have to refer to that. And now they have a $1.14 trillion budget. See why? I know a good scholar is very cautious about findings, premature declarations of findings. And both Dennis and I know you very well. You fit into that mode, and you are very cautious about making premature declarations. But with the naked eye, could the revised proposal see that number go up, taking into consideration everything? The rate of inflation.
It is bound to go up, because I know
there you go.
For a fact, not speculation, that prices have risen since first oil, 1990 to 24. They've risen at a compound rate, both in the United States and in Guyana, even though not as high in Guyana as we might have thought, but they've risen. So that will have to be added on to either the 5,000 US or the million.
Dennis?
Yeah, I think I saw some number about inflation in the US running at about 2.7 or something like that percent, and personal income went up by 0.4% in some recent period, which is like a few months ago, right? At the end of
Well,
last year.
I have looked at the figures on the graph already, but I don't
Mhm.
recall them right now, and I don't want to give a figure at this time.
Yeah, right.
But Guyana, for example, we have had fairly low interest rates as price levels increases that I've been telling people, and they're surprised to know that. But only 2 years where we had significant prices were the pandemic years with COVID and the year after. But this year the prices went down back to 2.3 or 2 point something percent.
Yeah.
Our prices, if you look at the graph of our price level, it's almost a flat line. You will not believe it. Some years the official figures were actually falling.
Mm-hmm.
Prices were going down rather than up.
Yeah.
In case you're just joining us, it's Politics 101 tonight. The open word with Professor Clive Thomas and my co-host, Dr. Dennis Canterburyd. In case some of you didn't join us last week, Dr. Canterburyd is a professor of sociology and in Connecticut. It's East Connecticut. Dennis?
Eastern Connecticut State University.
Eastern Connecticut State University. Dennis studied at the University of Guyana and would have worked with Professor Thomas in the Institute of Development Studies and taught at the University of Guyana. He's a long-standing WPA member, and that should not surprise many of you because it's part of what the WPA is. You know, we are all teachers. We are all teachers. And I've always said on this program, we all have our roles to play in society. And I'm generally people with similar interests and similar, ostensibly find themselves in union, in organizations. And it's always been one of the things that we in the WPA have paid attention to. And for us, education is not just education in the classroom, important though that is, but it's also public education. And I tell my own story that as a young boy, a schoolboy, growing up in Buxton, we were so lucky for all the so-called big boys and big girls to come through, all the bright boys and bright girls to come through the village, thanks to Brother UC. And so we were exposed very early to a certain kind of public education. So it was education in the classroom at school, but there was a kind of public education that was always present in that village. And I'm sure it occurred in other villages. And but we probably got more of it in Buxton than other communities. And I continue to tell that story of the farmers in the village, the older men who would come out of the back dam at 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Normally they would come out at 6 o'clock, you know, but they would come out at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, whenever Clive Thomas was built to speak. And when I grew old and would talk to them, and they would tell you, well, you know, Clive Thomas was talking about sugar and farmer cane and economics, and that's what their lives were about. And so the public education was really, really very important, and it continues to be important. And that's what we, the tradition we are continuing on this program. We sometimes don't give you all the so-called red meat that you want, although sometimes we go down that route. But we consider our role here to be largely grounded in the tradition of public education as a form of political mobilization. Because what we are doing is that we are mobilizing people. We are mobilizing people. And I make no bones about what we do here. We are trying to influence and to socialize a generation of Guyanese to begin to see their country and begin to see the world in which we live in a way that is consistent with the changes that have occurred. And the big change in recent times has been our transition into a petro state. And that has raised all kinds of questions. Questions for the environment, questions for the economy, questions for the household, questions for politics, questions for governance. And we have to work our way through that. Now, politics is not just about elections, although elections are central because elections are part of the whole notion of participatory democracy, right? But for elections to make sense and for elections to lead to the kind of transformation, there the other kind of work that has to be put in. And so when we come here every day of the week, and come here every week for Open Word, we are contributing to that tradition of public education as a form of mobilization. Tonight, we are, of course, talking about cash transfers as a form of economic development, and economic development that has consequences for the social well-being of the people of our country. Last week, we talked about growth and development, and so many of you wrote to me and thanking us for putting that issue in perspective and dealing with the complexities of that relationship between growth and development. We're talking tonight about direct cash money, as the old people would say. Direct cash money to each household. Now, it would benefit the poor, obviously. And it is targeted towards poverty, because poverty is a scourge. The Calypsonian shadow said, poverty is hell. And we know what hell is, right? And nobody wants to burn in hell. And so therefore, if we can extricate ourselves from poverty, we are really in shadows words, and from the standpoint of shadows philosophy, we are extricating ourselves from hell, right? If poverty is hell. And so that's where we are going. So when we say so much money to each household per year based on our takings from oil, we're not saying that as a means of winning an election or as a means of exciting people. It is towards the end of dealing with poverty. And all of us, no matter where we are today, we may be millionaires and multimillionaires today, we may be professors, we may be all kinds of things, but all of us come out of that cauldron. All of us come out of that cauldron of poverty. And poverty has very large and long footprints, because there have been people who have gotten rich in places like Guyana and then fall back into poverty. So the alleviation of poverty is central to development in our country, and ultimately central to our sense of identity and our sense of overcoming over that long period. Professor Thomas started tonight emotionally talking about overcoming the middle passage, and that if we could do that, then we could do anything else. And one of the things we have to set our sights on in Guyana, and we on this side, the Working People's Alliance and our friends and allies, we have set our sight on the alleviation of poverty, because we believe if we can remove that scourge, we open up the potential for so much more. Dennis Canterburyd, your closing thoughts, questions for CY?
Yes, I think I endorse what you just said there. I must say that 100%. The question is, how could we really target this notion of poverty, and I would push back against those who say that take the money and build factories for people to working. I would push back against them by saying no. People need, as again, I'm going to use the words of Lance Burleson, yam and cassava and plantain. People need food. People need to be able to take some money in the form of a universal cash transfer and do things for themselves and their families. And by the investments that they're making to do these small things in their communities, it could generate economy in their communities. And so rather than sit back and wait on some lofty idea for someone to come and build a factory and then employ you, you could take the money and do things for yourself, which would then stimulate the economy, the community. Another thing I wanted to ask CY is this whole notion of this UBI. Some people are interpreting this thing in such a literal way that, well, yeah, we're going to get this money, and but I don't think that's what you mean, CY. I don't think you mean that it's just about giving money as a social development program. I think what you mean is that this universal basic income is a part of some social development program. It can't just be I don't think you mean it's just a cash transfer, but it's about policies to ensure that social development is put on par with this whole notion of economic development.
Yeah, of course, Dennis. If you recall, it is treated as one of six. I don't know if you follow the series. One of six mechanisms applied by states that generate oil sales primarily as their source of income to ensure that they eradicate poverty and try to sustain the development and the sharing of oil within their countries. The five other measures cover the traditional areas of social engineering we're accustomed to. Targeted transfers, pensions, state employment, all these other things are complementary. So the focus is not to make this the only source of expenditure, to try to compensate for inequalities and deprivations in the state. It is one of six basic mechanisms that have been tried. And it's the only one that I found that has completely eradicated persistent poverty. There might be occasional pockets of individuals left hanging around the streets and things like that. But the persistence of an institutional type of embedded poverty, as George Beckford would call it, persistent poverty, that definitely disappears once you set about and use this as a target to supplement the other five mechanisms that have been identified. So the series of articles are in that context. And the first step prior to coming to this point is to elaborate the other five. We went through all the other five before we come to this. And that was done for us in large part, as I have made people realize, by the World Bank in what I consider to be an excellent study, which was a systematic diagnostic of Guyana and its future. And they've laid out the four basic mechanisms to pursue each of them, which I analyze, and we've already done that in a series of articles. But I add this as a complement to that. But I would say, in relation to what David has said about teaching, which is what I have always felt from the beginning, and I shared this a lot with Walter when we were together, because we used to run a lot of classes. What we're trying to do is to raise the level of consciousness. That might be an old-fashioned way of putting it, but what we're trying to do is to make people conscious of their own capabilities, their own expectations, their own meaning in life, is to raise a perception of oneself in a political process that is different from just being a recipient of the impulses coming from the political system. And in that, we would be hopeful that we could build what we call cadres of persons who would take on leadership, who would try to fight for a better and continuously better tomorrow, no matter where, till time, as long as time exists. It might be money income now, but it might be other six psychic types of income going down the line. We don't know. But the idea is to centrally make people aware and develop their own sense of the consciousness that we bring to bear on the notion of politics. In fact, I would go further to argue that the only significant thing that is different for the material world is the humankind's ability to create consciousness. This is an independent force in existence, beyond anything that the universe could have generated on its own. And this ability is what I think separates us from the rest of the material environment in which we live, and that is what we try to propel towards the future. Because it is the growth of this consciousness that has to inspire the growth of the communities and the growth of the interlocking human communities around the world. That is what we're trying to do, to build cadres for the future. People who will fight for a better tomorrow because it is needed. And we have to continuously grow, if not we stagnate.
Professor Clive Thomas there. Professor, are you finished?
Yeah, I'm finished.
Put it in context.
I'm very preachy today.
Yes, and so many of you and we are going to have a budget forum in the coming weeks. We let you know where we take a closer look. The parliamentarians in Parliament, they have analyzed the budget in the National Assembly from where they are, and what we plan to do in the WPA is to analyze the budget from another angle, to complement what the parliamentarians have done. And towards that end, we are going to have a budget forum, so look out for that. Two people made an excellent proposal, and they're asking if we can organize short online courses, 6 weeks online course on the Guyanese economy, on the petrostate economy, and so forth. And it's a proposal I'll take back to the WPA and see whether our resources permit us to do that. I know there are two areas, the areas of the petrostate and the economy in Guyana. People are asking for short courses where people, if it's once a week, we can have classes and people get to zero in on the issues in another more structured environment. And it's something that as I said, I'll take back to the party. Keep the suggestions coming. Please keep them coming, because ultimately we are talking about what role we all play in this pivotal moment in our history. Pivotal moment. If we get this moment right, we could get a lot right. If we get this moment wrong, we could get a lot wrong. And so we have to struggle and we have to fight on all fronts. All political parties don't have to do the same thing. There are different roles for different parties, different groups, and so forth. And I think more and more we are beginning to appreciate that the struggle is much more than the one-dimensional way that the government and the reactionaries in the society would like to tie us down to. You know, we all want violence. We all want this. We all want that, and so on and so forth. You know, and when the violence itself is coming from those who control the state. Professor Thomas, thank you very much again.
Okay, David.
And Dennis, thanks a lot. We'll next week we'll come back again. Tomorrow night, by popular demand, we're going to do a program on Gaza. What's happening in Gaza? We have talked about it here and there on this program, but we're going to do a full program tomorrow night on Gaza. I'm holding the guest on the program as a surprise. By tomorrow you will know, but I can tell you it's going to be high-powered, and we are going to get in to what's happening in Gaza. As you know, the South Africans went to the ICJ and asked that World Court to pronounce on the genocide that is taking place there. We in Guyana, whether at the level of our government or the level of our activists, we have a moral responsibility to lend our voices against what is happening there. Because as post-plantation societies, we are vulnerable. We are as vulnerable as the Palestinians are. And remember, our Guyana, if history had turned in another direction, could have been dealing with that problem that the Palestinians are dealing with. Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. And so I'll see you all tomorrow night when we begin our conversation, because I rather suspect that tomorrow's conversation is going to be part one of that larger conversation. Good night, and of course, the watchword is love.
Good night, David.
From the same place, that make the same trip, on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we woman and we children. That must be the